Good morning. I'm happy to stand before you today. I'm a little bit nervous. Yesterday I was spraying a couple extra jobs on a Saturday, and I was just putting up my spray rig, and then Jason texted me and said he's sick and he needs me to preach a lesson this morning. So I threw together what I could, and that's the material I'm going to present to you today, and I hope it's beneficial to everybody here. I see we have a lot of guests with us today. Reiterate what Bruce said this morning. Happy Mother's Day to all of our mothers. I'm hoping that you can take something with you today. Thanks to Cody for reading Titus chapter 2. The title of my lesson this morning is that we're in a culture war. It's all around us. We see it on the news every day. It isn't the culture war that they would like us to believe, where it's liberal and conservative, or Republican or Democrat. What we're in a culture war between sin and righteousness. In Titus chapter 2, that passage that he read, it finishes by saying, "The grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled." And in the first part of it, he goes through and he lists older men and older women, younger men and younger women, bond servants. What he's talking about there is how to live your everyday life as a Christian. And it makes it in contrast to what we read in chapter 1 and verse 12, where he talks about one of the Cretans, a prophet of their own, said, "Cretans are always liars and evil beasts and lazy gluttons." So he's sending this letter to Titus, trying to tell him, this is what you need to tell your brethren, how to be different from the rest of the people around them, and how to establish a Christian culture. And we remember Jesus' words back in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16, specifically in verse 13, chapter 5, verse 13, not chapter 13, verse 5. Specifically in verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." There, Jesus is talking about our responsibility as disciples of him, that we're to influence the world to be more salty, as he's talking about. But salt is just an analogy for the type of righteous behavior that Christians ought to have, that we should be influencing other people to be righteous as well. And it's a war. It's a constant struggle. It's a fight between us and the world, the influence they're going to have on us and the influence we're going to have on them. So, in what ways are we in war against the world? And I have about 5 or 6 different things that it's not an exhaustive list by any means, but just a few things that it seems just constantly berated with every single day of our lives, about how the world is trying to influence us and how to change even our way of thinking about some fundamental things. So we're going to go through a couple of them, and then at the end of the lesson I have just a couple things that we can do to help us fight the war. But the way that I set it up is we're going to read what the Bible says about how to have behavior, and then we're going to look and see how the world has said it should be, or how the world acts in response to it. So the first thing, I was going to start with marriage, because what used to be the most fundamental unit of society was marriage, was a man and a woman, and then somehow, some way, the world got so far wrong that now we can't even define what a man and a woman is. So the first thing that I'd like to just talk about is our sexuality, who we are, our carnal beings, who we are as physical beings are in our sexuality. So let's start with Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4. There the Hebrew writer says, "Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and the adulterous." So it's just so commonplace today. I can remember being in high school. I can remember being in high school in the locker room. Man, boys' locker rooms, those are something different. But just to be, the idea that I was going to wait till marriage to have sex, that idea was so foreign to people that they would look at me like I was just a completely different being, that I was talking nonsense. This idea that our bodies are to be held in honor, that we're supposed to save ourselves for a certain person, and that we're supposed to not be loose with our living. It's a foreign concept to the world. It's something that I don't think they quite understand. They don't hold it in high regard like Christians are meant to do. So that's my experience with it. I'm sure that y'all have experienced something of the same. But we ought to hold ourselves as the temple of God, and to save ourselves and to be holy as he would have us to be. And then in Romans chapter 1, this is another part of it. And I think it's just a natural a natural path that we take, a slippery slope, if you will. And I know, of course, I wasn't alive 100 years ago, so I wouldn't know about it. But I do know that there was something called like a sexual revolution where, it became commonplace to have sex before marriage. And then we just kind of went down a slope where then it became homosexuality was normal. And then now transgenderism is normal. And I don't know where we are tomorrow, but I know it's not headed in the right direction. And it made me think of Paul's letter to the Romans, where in verse 24, it said that God gave them up to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. And from there, it begins to talk about how men gave up the natural use of the woman, and woman gave up the natural use of the man. And they burned with their lust with one another. And we have to fight the same thing at home. We have to teach our kids even from a young age. Whenever we were doing the yearly Bible study that Jason puts out every year, one of the things that I didn't think I would have to ever teach my 6-year-old, I didn't think that it would be something that he would even have to worry about until he was older. But in the beginning, God created man and woman, and he didn't create anybody else. There was only two genders. There was only the man and the woman who were created. But it seems that even that gets mixed up these days. And I'm sure we've all seen on social media before or on the news how people take TikToks of their 6-year-old kids. And it's the last one that I saw was a woman talking to her daughter. And her daughter was I think she was just messing around more than anything, but she was wearing a backwards baseball cap. She said, "Mama, I want to be a boy today." Well, instead of doing a normal thing and just telling the girl, "Well, you're a girl, you can't be a boy just because you want to be a boy," she just fed into it. She was proud of it. She put it on social media that she was so excited that her 6-year-old daughter was taking a stand for transgenderism, as if a 6-year-old even understands such a thing. But that's where we've progressed to, and this defilement of our bodies and this debasement of our minds that began with just not understanding the holiness of our bodies and giving ourselves up to lust, that now we're feeding into a 6-year-old's fantasy about being a boy for the day. So the next thing is marriage. Well, if you would turn to Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19. This is where Jesus is talking about marriage. And specifically, he's being questioned about divorce. But he kind of, as Jesus had a tendency to do, he went past the question and answered the fundamental principle that they were getting wrong. They were asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? And then Jesus went back to the beginning, and he said, he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let man not separate. So they're asking a question about divorce, and he's actually teaching them about what marriage was originally intended to be. It was originally intended to be one man and one woman for life. Divorce wasn't even, you don't find divorce even, I'm trying to think, maybe not even in the book of Genesis. It's not until later on whenever he's talking to the Israelites, whenever they are being given the law, that divorce even comes up. But for the first several chapters, I'm sure that divorce was never even mentioned. It wasn't in God's plan for divorce to be there. But it's rampant now. And, about every other marriage these days seems to be having a divorce. And one of the big ones that's in the news right now is, I think, Bill Gates. And it's one of those things where it's such a casual thing that there's not even a reason for it. It's just, well, we don't get along anymore, so we'll divorce now. They don't, the world has taken something that was supposed to be a holy institution, a lifelong commitment, and they've turned it into something casual. They've turned it into something that can just be done away with at the drop of a hat because we aren't growing together anymore. And not only is it a temporary thing that, is only there for as long as it's fun, but the roles of marriage have been completely disregarded. Women run their households. We know about, at least several times in the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs 21:9 and 25:24 and 27:15, how it talks about contentious wives and wives that refuse to submit to their husbands, as Ephesians chapter 5:22 specifically tells them to do. And it's not just that wives aren't submitting to husbands, it's that husbands aren't stepping up and being the leaders of their households like God intended them to be. Yes, marriage is a unit. Yes, marriage is a partnership, but there are defined roles within marriage, and the man is supposed to lead his household. And we've disregarded that as well in the world. And then we have modesty issues. Turn with me to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. We're going to read 3 or 4 verses here that talks about your outward appearance. And in the New Testament it talks a lot how women should adorn themselves, but we'll flip back to the Old Testament and look at some of that stuff too. But 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9. Women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. And then 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Then we'll look at a couple of Old Testaments, starting with Isaiah chapter 3, verses 16 through 19. Isaiah 3, 16 through 19. Because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with their outstretched necks, glancing wantonly with their eyes, mincing along as they go, tinkling with their feet. Therefore the Lord will strike with a scab the heads of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. In that day the Lord will take away the finery of their anklets, the headbands and the crescents, the pendants, the bracelets, and the scarves, the headdresses, the armlets, the sashes, the perfume boxes, and the amulets, the signet rings and nose rings, the festival robes, the mantles, the cloaks and the handbags, the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans, and the veils. Instead of perfume, there will be rottenness, and instead of a belt, a rope, and instead of well-set hair, baldness. and instead of a rich robe, a skirt of sackcloth, and branding instead of beauty. And then we'll look in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7. This is the famous passage where David was anointed king, and Samuel passed over all of his older brothers that were large in size, tall and handsome. And then down in verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. This is speaking of one of David's brothers. For the Lord sees not as a man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. So when we typically think of modesty, we almost always think of uncovering our nakedness, which is a problem for sure. I mean, you can't hardly walk down the street. I was driving down 5th Street, and a woman was walking with just a bra and yoga pants on, pushing a stroller. I'm like, is that the example you want to set for your child? But whatever, that's the way the world sees uncovering their nakedness. They see it as a casual thing, nothing to even take a second note of. But the other aspect of modesty is being humble, not wanting to flaunt your wealth, not wanting to bring unnecessary attention to your outward appearance, but to let the inner person be the thing that people see and that people notice. And we just see almost like a spiral of people just seeking to constantly outdo each other. And if one person has a nice thing, well, then I've got to get a nicer thing. And then the person who had the nice thing said, well, that's not good enough anymore because they have something nicer. So then they go find something nicer. And it's just a spiral and endless competition between who has the nicer thing. And what they're not understanding is that sometimes it's just better to be content with what you have. You don't have to have the next model or the next nice thing. Look with me in Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Instead of seeing the nice thing that your friend or your neighbor has and wanting to outdo them, why not just be happy for them? Why not be glad that they can have a nice thing and rejoice with them, and not be ambitious or conceited, but have humility. And it's important to remember a lesson that was taught to the Israelites back in Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 17, where there Moses is instructing the people of Israel, beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers. So I think sometimes we look at our personal possessions and we like to take pride in them. We like to flaunt them off, but we forget that nothing we have here on this earth is given to us aside from God. And even the riches that we enjoy, we should be humble and understand that they're temporary, that they're not the most important thing, and that it all comes from God anyway. So we shouldn't take any unnecessary pride in the things that we're given. And then finally in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. The next piece of culture that I think the world gets very wrong is raising our children. In Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 4, it says that fathers should train their children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And I feel like we've kind of let our responsibilities go in this regard every now and then. We don't see the family, we don't see parents as the people that are supposed to be the ones instructing our kids. Sometimes we pass that buck down the road. We think it's the Bible class teachers or God forbid the school teachers, that they should be the ones raising our children. But that responsibility falls to us as parents. We're the ones who should be opening up our Bibles and teaching our kids, because culture starts at home. What your children see first in this life is the family unit. If you want to teach your kid the proper way to be married, exemplify that in your life. Show them how a husband leads. Show them how a wife submits. Show them how they act together in unity and harmony. And even whenever there's a disagreement, that divorce is never on the table. It's not an option. That it's a lifelong commitment. If you want your kids to learn good marriages, exemplify that. If you want to learn your kids to teach your kids how to treat their bodies as holy, you should treat your body as holy. Do not flaunt your nakedness around where they can see it in public. Obviously, at home is a little bit different, but whenever you go out in public, do you take off the sleeping wear, the pajamas, or whatever, and you put on clothes that would be modest to wear in front of other people? And are you content with the things that you have, or do you constantly seek to one up your neighbor, or you are not modest with your stuff? If you want your kids to grow up in the culture of Christianity, you have to start that culture at your house. Otherwise, they're going to go out into the world, and the world's going to infect them. The world's going to teach them their culture, the way that the world sees their bodies, or the way that the world sees marriages, or any other the things that we're going to talk about. You have to start at home. And for us as adults, one of the biggest things that we have to train ourselves to understand is the principle found in Psalms 127, starting in verse 3. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. And we have to view our children as rewards and as a thing to be desired, not as a thing where I just worked a 10-hour day and I come home and I'm hot and I'm tired, and then, there's 4 kids waiting for me. And they're just a burden. They're just something that I don't even want to deal with. We have to retrain our minds to think of them as, that's the reward. That's the reason I went to work, was to provide for these children. And whenever I get home, that's whenever the most important work starts, and that's raising our children. And that this almost goes without mentioning, but just the abortion rate is out of control, where unplanned pregnancies come up, or back to the sexuality and not treating our bodies as holy. Well, then we end up pregnant, and then now it's just a child is just a thing to be discarded nowadays. And so that's the world's view on children. But we have to actively fight against that. And it's not just saying, abortion is wrong. It's showing the world that, hey, children are a thing to be desired, and they are a thing that we should want to take care of, and they should be a blessing for us. And then another thing that the world views in its culture is almost as another god is science. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 20. O Timothy, guard the deposit entrusted to you. Avoid the irreverent babble and contradictions of what is falsely called science, or your Bible might say knowledge. The world as a culture has turned science into a god. And that's seen all the way from the creation of man. They view evolution as the natural course that man took, that man wasn't created. And again, this is taught to our kids, even if they don't specifically teach it as evolution. Clayton brought home a homework paper, and it's something about dinosaurs. And right there in the print was 100 million years ago. It didn't talk about evolution. It didn't even mention it. But from the first grade, when he took that homework page home, he's taught that the world is millions or billions of years old. He doesn't understand evolution. He doesn't understand the long-term consequences of that. But when they get older and they get to the evolution part of things, well, it's already concrete in their mind. The earth is billions of years old. And then evolution is just a natural step after that. Well, we have to teach a different culture. We have to teach creation, and we have to fight against letting other influences teach our children what is called science. And I also include in this the coronavirus, just because, in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 27, Matthew 6 and 27, Jesus says, "And which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life?" And then we have in the book of James where he talks about how our life is nothing but a vapor. The United States government, there is a way to be safe. I mean, I'm sure everybody who gets into their car puts their seatbelt on. I mean, it's one of those simple things. In fact, you get a ticket if you don't, because it's such a easy way to save lives is by putting your seatbelt on. It's been proven time and time again. Buckle your kids, buckle yourself, make sure that your car seats are there. But whenever science tells us that the safe thing to do is to stay home and not come to church, we have to make a decision. We have to ask ourselves, have we made science our God? Do we take our commands and our responsibilities from the CDC or whoever that tells us to stay home, or do we take our commands from God, where we have the example in Acts 20 and verse 7 about how they met on the first day of the week to break bread? Have we ourselves exalted science above the commandments of God? We know the world has, but we have to make sure that we're not exalting it to a position that it doesn't need to be either. Then the last thing that I wrote down for the world's culture versus a Christian culture is our work ethic. Turn to Colossians 3:23, excuse me. "Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men." So we see all the time in the world the tendency to, whenever somebody does a job, or even if it's a good or a bad job, they want the reward. Award. They want to be noticed for their work. They want to be commendated for their work. And seeking a reward in and of itself is not wrong. I seek a reward too, but my reward is from my Heavenly Father. I too want to be rewarded, but I don't want to be rewarded by men with a transient thing that will pass away. I want to be rewarded by my Heavenly Father. So we have to work knowing that our work isn't just for ourselves here on this earth. And that at the very least, let's see if I got my citation right. I think in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. "Yes, but if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." So at the very least, our work shouldn't even be just for ourselves. I go to work to take care of my family. That should be first and forefront in our mind as we work as Christians. And then again in James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and make trade and make a profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil." So what do we do? This, like I said, that wasn't an exhaustive list. I'm sure that you are sitting in your seat and you're thinking of your own ideas of what the culture of the world, how it fights against our culture as Christians. So what do we do? How do we fight this world? Well, first we have to understand that this war has always been fought. I used modern day examples, But all the scriptures of that I use to show how we ought to live as Christians, the Christians in the first century were dealing with the exact same thing. Homosexuality is not something new. That's what Romans 1 is talking about. He's talking to them about how they gave themselves up to the lust of their flesh. So it's not like that's a new thing that we're dealing with now that Christians 2,000 years ago didn't. There was people in Thessalonica who had stopped working, period, because they thought the judgment day was just around the corner and that they wouldn't even be here much longer. So issues with work ethic, with raising kids, modesty, all that stuff was an issue that first century Christians dealt with. So understand that this culture war is not new to us. In Ephesians 6 and verse 12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against the cosmic powers of the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. So they were fighting the same war in the first century that we're fighting today. And then we have 1 Corinthians 10:13. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. So don't feel like we're in a new world. We're in a new era where things are just so much more difficult than what they were 2,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago. God's law has always been in direct opposition to the way that the world has been destined to go since the fall of man. Secondly, it can't be won through physical means. Can't be won. Oh, sorry, yeah, looked at my wrong citation wrong. It can't be won through physical means. John chapter 18 and verse 36. There Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, for though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. So, like I was mentioning earlier, whenever we're teaching our kids, in order to wage this war, we don't go out in the streets. We don't fight physical fights. We don't do any of that stuff. What we do is we teach others the gospel. We try to be that salt that Jesus mentioned in Matthew chapter 5. We try to influence people to think differently, to think as Christ thought, and to follow in accordance with his will. And then not only that, but we teach the next generation. Consider Judges chapter 2 and verse 10, where we get that just, it's always stuck with me. It's just that little snippet of, it's almost like a passing comment. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. It's such a powerful sentence that it just seems like it's stuck in the middle there. But what a condemnation of the generation before, that there arose another generation who didn't even know God. What does that say about that generation that came before? Did they just not even bother to even mention God, to mention his precepts, to mention how they took over this land, where they came from, anything about their history? We can fall into the same trap, to where we think we're coming to church on Sundays, so our kids are getting introduced to the culture, but then they go home and they spend the rest of the week in school and doing extracurricular activities, and we just shelve Christianity over here. This culture that we're trying to teach our kids, we just shelve it until the next Sunday comes around. But that's not the biblical pattern that we need to follow. We don't want to raise a new generation that doesn't know God, or that knows just enough about God and the Bible and Christianity to get it wrong. And that's how we come up with thousands upon thousands of denominations because we teach them a little bit, but we don't teach them the full truth, so that whenever error comes along or false teaching, they're not prepared to fight against it. They don't know enough of the scriptures to be able to resist the world's influence upon them. And then finally, in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 23 through 25, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day draw near. And then in Ephesians chapter 4, I'm not going to take the time to read that whole first section, but where it's talking about there being one body and one spirit and one hope and one Lord and one faith and one baptism. And he goes on to say that we're supposed to build each other up in the body. One of the most effective way to fight this war is to realize you're not alone in this war. That everybody gathered together into this room who has a spiritual mindset is your ally. That they're here to help you fight this war. And that by associating yourselves with people of like precious faith, you can be influenced by somebody else's faith. Just like you can be influenced by the world, and you go out into the world and you have their influences every single week, at the very least, once a week on the first day of the week, but oftentimes many more than that, we have the opportunity to assemble with people who can restore our faith, who can help build us up, who can influence us in a way that the world can't, that they can bring us closer to God. And we need to take advantage of that. We need to be here at every opportunity. We need to be influencing one another, building each other up. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. We need to be here to help each other fight the war. Well, that's all I have this morning. That's the lesson. I hope that it's been beneficial to y'all. I hope that you can feel re-energized and renewed and better able to fight the war. If you haven't picked up your sword and started your fight, if you haven't been baptized and joined the Lord's army, we offer that invitation to you now. If you'd like to submit to his will and to become one of the brethren here, or if you've perhaps fallen victim to the culture war and that you've gone back into the war and gone back into the world and you've been influenced and like to return, and you need the prayers and the strength of your brethren here, we also offer that invitation while we stand and sing.